Thank you, Bill. And thank you, everyone, for your attention. Let's cover now part 2 of part 2, where we're going to launch into 1920 and take it forward to 1945. As Bill mentioned, revivals became a thing here in Great Falls at Smith Chapel. And the Reverend C.A. Scrimshaw was our pastor at the time, and he held revivals, and they were heartwarming events. And Mrs. Ruth Downs, who, as we remember, was a granddaughter of Jesse and Lucina Smith, she says, the revivals give many, many souls have been converted at this altar, and many backsliders reclaimed their conversion, and all the congregation was blessed. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any real descriptions of our revivals. What did they look like? Where were they held? Was it all the churches in the charge, or was it just Smith Chapel? Was it indoors? Was it outdoors? Was it a day event or a week-long event? We don't know. But I did a little looking around on the internet, and I was able to find a photo of a tent meeting. And this is from 1921, according to the internet. And it's a tent meeting in Russell, Oklahoma. But perhaps this is what the revivals here at Smith Chapel might have looked like in the early 1920s. Nice crowd. I'm sure it was heartwarming, like Mrs. Downs said, and just really revived the congregations. In 1922, I want to give you just a little history of what was going on in the county. Fairfax County established a centralized school district, and many of our smaller schools were closed at that time. And here we are nearly 60 years after the Civil War, but the nation is still dealing with issues related to segregation. Fairfax County alone had 7 high schools that were for whites only, 117 elementary schools that were for whites only, and 26 elementary schools for blacks. So that's an interesting period in our history. In 1923, our pastor here was Reverend Melvin Baker. And according to Mrs. Parrish, the quality of his pulpit ministry helped in the attendance at Herndon Charge, because remember, he's serving all the churches on our charge. She said he was keenly interested in the unification of all Methodists. We had split apart before the Civil War. She described his ministry as being in the name of Jesus Christ to all who in sorrow or need of any kind marked him a true shepherd of the flock. His ability to see good in the worst man brought him love and much criticism, sadly. And he died in 1943 and was laid to rest on 13 August 1943, but thankfully his greatest wish had been granted. He had seen the unification of Methodism in 1939, which we will get to momentarily, 4 years before he died. So to die and have your greatest wish been realized is a wonderful thing. 1923 to 1925, pastor was Reverend P.C. Philly, and he took over for Reverend Baker because he left due to illness. Mrs. Ruth Downs described him as a thoughtful, accommodating man with a highly chivalrous attitude toward women. He was an old-time Navy chaplain and had a most exalted opinion towards women and what was due them. Would have loved to have met him. He was also described as a short, stout, elderly gentleman. And he held big revivals and called evangelist Reverend Mossberg from Washington, D.C., along with Reverend Hoffman and Reverend Mason to some of his revivals. So the revivals are still an ongoing thing here at Smith Chapel. 1926 to 27, our pastor was Reverend W.R. McClay. And for some reason, he was the first pastor who did not hold revivals each year. Unfortunately, we don't know why he canceled them. But Mrs. Downs had some pretty strong feelings about the fact that he did so, and she said, all pastors held good old-fashioned revivals each year. We're sorry to see the old-fashioned revival series, which are going out of style, for no church will prosper properly, spiritually, unless they are held each year. 1934 to 1935, our pastor was Reverend Richard T. Scholl, and he introduced a tradition that had become pretty popular in the rural South called dinner on the grounds. And I am fortunate that I grew up going to dinners on the grounds because though I grew up in Southern California, my mother was from North Carolina. So when we would come to visit my grandparents, we would go to church at Lane's Chapel Methodist Church, which we could see from the farmhouse, which my family had gone to for generations. And they would have dinners on the ground after the services, because in the South, dinner is at lunchtime and supper is at night, because all the farm workers needed their big meal in the middle of the day. So that was dinner. So dinners on the grounds were a wonderful tradition, and it was potluck. Everybody would bring great foods. And I was able to find a painting. I love this painting because it looks just like the ones I went to. A Church Outdoor Dinner in the Rural South by Olivia Thomason. And it is a wonderful representation of that rural tradition. However, they noted that Reverend Scholl did not believe in holding suppers at the church, as there was only this sanctuary here to move into in the case of bad weather. And he didn't like having all the food and stuff in the chapel, I suppose. So as a result, all suppers and luncheons were held in people's homes, which they noted meant a lot of hard work for the people organizing it, because they had to carry not just the food, but the silverware and the dishes and clean all that up afterwards and get it back to the church. 1934 to 35, Reverend Scholl had not only done away with the revivals, but he did away with organized Sunday school classes. Again, no reason given as to why, but they noted that this affected the collection and the interest of the young a great deal more than expected. However, he and his wife did revive the Epworth League for the young. The league began in 1889 as a Methodist Young Adult Association for those aged 18 to 35. It became known later as the Methodist Youth Fellowship, and finally the United Methodist Youth Fellowship. Many of us may have been members of that as we were growing up. He and Mrs. Scholl also held vacation Bible schools, which was well attended. I also went to vacation Bible schools growing up. Mrs. Scholl started cottage prayer meetings, but when many of the attendees began skipping church services after going to the cottage prayer meetings, they discontinued the cottage prayer meetings, as you can well imagine. And finally, he eventually closed the young people's meetings for lack of interest, because during these years of the Great Depression, the whole country is facing financial difficulties. And one of the first things they probably stopped doing with their money was giving to the churches and even attending church, because things were so bad. 1936 to 37, our pastor was Reverend Walter J. Baker. And Mrs. Parrish notes that the Ladies' Aid Society records that Reverend Baker and his wife both joined the society. Reverend Baker was an elderly man when he came to Smith Chapel, and he was very ill. However, he was dearly loved by all, and when he preached a sermon, your soul was refreshed, says Mrs. Parrish. However, after suffering 2 strokes, he died on 20 July 1937. At that point, the first and only pastor to pass away while on the charge. He is buried in the Oakwood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. 1938 brings us Reverend Robert R. Stephen. After the sad loss of their much-loved pastor, the members were looking ahead to better times. The Ladies' Aid book records that many members had friends who would also attend services here at Smith Chapel, even though they never became formal members, and they gave of their time and their talents, but still wouldn't join. Did a lot of work for the church and attended services, but never formally joined. However, they were always most welcome, she said. In 22 October 1938, a trustees meeting was held to discuss bringing electricity to the church. They had to sign papers in connection with this project, and she said none objected. In November of 1938, a line was run to the church. And finally, in 1939, the church itself was wired for electricity. 1939, the Methodists reunite. After the pre-Civil War split in the church, we were at last reunited in this year when the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, and the Methodist Protestant Church agreed to merge at the Uniting Conference that was held in Kansas City, Missouri. And as Ms. Parrish noted, at last, we all are Methodist Church. Hallelujah. 1940, Reverend Forrest Reynolds was pastor And Mrs. Parrish describes him as a crippled, fat, and bald-headed man. Smith's Chapel congregation first met him at Brown's Chapel and were so surprised. They felt he certainly did not look like a man of the gospel, but as time moved forward, the group learned to love him devotedly. For the gospel he preached showed him to be a great master for the God above. There were no dull moments. And I just love Mrs. Parrish's descriptions because, as we noted, she had no formal education, no high school degree, no college degree, and yet she was such a wordsmith, such a lover of language, obviously. Reverend Reynolds was also a great lover of music, she noted. He taught the choir to sing in bass, alto, and soprano, and his brother sang tenor parts. There were 18 people in the choir. Can you imagine? I think when I was in the choir here, we maybe had 8 or 10. Sounded good, but 18 people in a choir would be wonderful in this little chapel. She said, "This was when the hearts were full of the Spirit of God and came forth in song." 23 May 1940, Smith Chapel's 50th anniversary. Mrs. Ruth Downs prepared a history of Smith Chapel from the beginning as she knew it, having learned it at the feet of her mother, Mrs. Emily Smith Jenkins, daughter of Jesse and Lucina Smith. Mrs. Ruth Downs was born in 1890, the same era that our church was founded. So she really did grow up literally with the church and saw all the changes that took place. The Ladies' Aid Society for the anniversary prepared a gathering and a supper for the ministers, past and present, and their wives. It was held on Mrs. Ruth Downs's lawn on a beautiful spring day. Mrs. Parrish says, nature blooming in all its glory, life springing full of joy, and the church going forward with great expectation of making the future a brighter church. Reverend Reynolds was very impressed, reportedly, by the memories of the past in his new church. He had a heart for the children, trained them with the Methodist catechism. The average attendance of the children was 20 at that time. He also worked hard for the teenagers and young adults, making sure that church was their lives. And that's a noble cause for sure. 1941, as we know, America was launched into World War II at this time. Back in 1940, the Selective Training and Service Act had been passed on 16 September 1940 by Congress, establishing the first peacetime conscription in U.S. history. It required all men between the ages of 18 and 64 to register with the Selective Service. America, of course, had joined the war after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941, that date that will live in infamy. And our boys answered the call. 37 boys from this community alone served, and their names are recorded on our framed honor roll in Lambert Hall. Many of you have probably seen this framed list of all of the local boys who answered the call. The names are listed. It's hard to see in this photo, but the names are all listed. And there is a beautiful tree, a drawing of a tree whose branches shade the list of names. And that drawing of the tree was produced by Miss Jean Wallace, who happened to be the daughter of the U.S. Vice President Henry A. Wallace. So she drew the picture. And Miss Parrish notes that all the boys were remembered on their birthdays. And as Bill noted a few moments ago, the name Spalding pops up on here. The very first name on the list at the top is General Sidney Spalding. So from the top down, our boys answered the call. 1943 to 44, our pastor, Reverend E.C. Gunn, was a single man, a student, a very sincere young man on religion, Mrs. Parrish says. There was no parsonage on our charge at that time, so the pastor boarded with some of the members. And to give you an idea of what this area was like at the time, in 1943, you would think things would have been a little more modern, I guess. But the only paved roads in our area in 1943 were the Georgetown Pike, the Leesburg Pike, and Seneca Road. The rest of them were all those dirt roads that we saw last week with the potholes and the ruts and the horses and wagons trying to navigate it. Had to be a mess. A local man, Mr. Emery Poole, there's the Poole name again, was called upon to build some picnic tables for Smith Chapel for all our dinners on the grounds. He built 4 nice large tables with attached benches, she said, which could be brought inside the new social hall to be used for dinners and luncheons. She said they would seat 10 comfortably each and 12 if you squoze in. July 22, 1944 saw the first recorded wedding at Smith Chapel since the double wedding way back in 1896, when Benjamin Poole married Julia Kadar and John Palmer married Mary Catherine Poole. The happy couple in 1944 was Walter Booth and Leona Alberta Costello. Alberta's family had long been a part of Smith Chapel, and Alberta herself served as the WSCS secretary for a number of years, the Women's Society for Christian Service. And she hosted many delightful suppers at her home. But she left in 1955 to join the Dranesville Church, and Mrs. Parrish says she was very much missed. 1944 to 45, Pastor Reverend J.C. Long Jr., also a student, and our district superintendent at the time was Dr. J.C. Robertson. Mrs. Parrish relates a vivid description of the church services during this period, and she says, the district superintendent, J.C. Robertson, often gave the sermon, and members could never forget these services. Reverend Robertson constantly looking up to the ceiling, or never looked at the congregation, never looked at any notes. His words rung through the sanctuary, never to be forgotten, words to reach the heart and live on the conscience of the soul. 1945, up until this time, our little church had been heated by a wood stove that was placed right here in the front of the pulpit in the center aisle, had a long stovepipe that extended way up to the ceiling. And have you ever looked up and noticed this square panel covering the beadboard on the ceiling and wondered what it was for? Well, that was for the long stovepipe that extended straight up from the stove up into the roof and to the chimney on top of the roof. Maybe it looked like this one. We don't know for sure, but that is one I was able to find from that era, and looks like it would do the job quite well in here. In 1945, they decided to do away with that, and the Women's Society for Christian Service, the WSCS, they decided to purchase an oil burner for the chapel. And she notes that they paid $68.25 for it. Again, perhaps one something like this. This is the number 525 one, Perfection Kerosene Burning Room Heater. And Perfection was evidently a brand that had quite a few versions of their space heaters. So we have gotten now to the end of World War II, and we're going to close that today. That's it for the second part. Please join us again next week for the final section of our history, Troubles After World War II and Rebirth. Thank you all very much.